Hey guys, this is a video to go over the very basics of what a Punnett square is and how we can answer questions after filling out a Punnett square. Okay, so there's a few terms, there's about 4 to 6 terms that we need to just have a real good understanding of to apply for these problems. So we're going to kind of go through those. So every organism has a collection of traits. Right? Those traits are determined by an organism's genotype. And the way we look at genotypes are through different alleles, which are represented by letters. So we can have an individual that has a genotype of TT and big T, and maybe that's a trait, that's a genotype that codes for a trait. The phenotype is going to be the physical characteristic that the genotype expresses. So if you have an individual, say you have a pea plant that has the genotype of big T, its phenotype that it expresses is that it is a tall pea plant. Okay. Similarly, maybe we have a genotype where it is big T, little t, and I'll explain the big versus little here in a second. That's going to be a pea plant that is still tall. Okay. Because remember, when we have a capital T, this is showing a dominant allele. So allele is one of two factors you can put into a genotype. Alleles will determine the genotype and will determine the overall phenotype or physical characteristic of the organism. The lowercase guy is called a recessive allele. Okay. And so when we get to the point where we have a genotype of little t, this expresses a genotype of short. So notice we only ever have the recessive trait expressed when we have both recessive alleles. And that gets into our next point of homozygous versus heterozygous. So homozygous is when we can have the same allele in the genotype. Okay. So if we think about an example of that in the above question, we could do big T, or we could do little t. If we just know an organism is homozygous, we don't know exactly if it's homozygous dominant or homozygous recessive. Heterozygous, on the other hand, is when we have different alleles in genotype. So this is only ever going to be one dominant and one recessive. So if you ever know that an organism is heterozygous or has a heterozygous genotype, you automatically know its alleles. So with this information, we can create a Punnett square. So we're going to look at this word problem here. So the gene for polydactyly, or 6 fingers, is dominant. It's by uppercase D. The gene for 5 fingers is recessive. What is the probability of a heterozygous polydactyl male and a homozygous recessive mom having a 5-finger child? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and highlight any of the important terms that we might need. And for this, you want to highlight those terms that we just talked about. So for the male, for example, there's a dad that is heterozygous polydactyly, and the mom is homozygous recessive. Okay, so heterozygous, again, we know that it's going to be one dominant, one recessive. So this is going to be big D, little d. Okay, so there's the male. And then the female is homozygous recessive. So homozygous is telling us that both of the alleles are same. Recessive is telling us that both of them are lowercase. Oops, and that should be little d, Okay. Our phenotype options, we can either have, that's the physical trait, you can either have 6 fingers, or you could have 5 fingers. Okay, and then we could just put our parent genotypes here as well. Our genotypes, we can have 3 genotype options, right? We can have big D. We can have heterozygous, uppercase, lowercase, and then we can have homozygous recessive. both little d. Okay, so now that we have our parents' genotypes, we're going to go ahead and move these to the side. And you want to put one on the top and one on the left. Each allele going in one square, or above one square. So we'll say the mom goes on the top, and then the dad is on the left here. Once we do that, we can go ahead and just fill out this Punnett square. And really all we need to do is just take these and drag them into the box. So we put a big D there and there. We can go ahead and move this D down here. Move this guy over in all of the boxes. And then move this one over here. Okay, so we finished our Punnett square, but how do we know what it means? How are we able to analyze it? Well, each box in a Punnett square is a potential offspring. So if this mom and dad had 4 kids or had a kid, they want to be able to figure out the probability that their child will have 6 fingers or 5 fingers. Right? Remember, we talked about in the opening statement, the gene for polydactyly is dominant. So if they have a dominant allele, they're going to have 6 fingers. The only way that a child that they have is going to have 5 fingers is if it's having both recessive genes, or it's little d, little d. So if we look at this, we can see we have 2 homozygous recessive traits. Okay, so that's going to go in our phenotypic ratio, where we have 2 for 5 fingers, and then the 2 on top, these are 2 for 6 fingers. So our ratio, which compares our different options, is going to be 2 to 2 or 1 to 1. Right, so that's 6 fingers to 5 fingers. You don't normally need to put that in the bottom, but just for clarity. All right, for each child they have that could be 6 fingers, they have an equal chance that they could have a child with 5 fingers. For the genotypic ratio, we're looking at our options between our 3 genotypes. So in the Punnett square, we don't have any that has homozygous dominant, so that's just going to be a 0. For heterozygous, we have 2. You can highlight those real quick. And then for homozygous recessive, we have those 2 that we talked about. So this is one that's also 2 to 2, which we can simplify to 1 to 1. And then the question asks, what is the probability of a 5-fingered child? So for that, we have to know that 5-fingered child is homozygous recessive. So we're looking for little d. And we can see out of a 4 square box, 2 of them are an option. So that would be 2 out of 4, or 50%, which would be our answer. All right, so for any Punnett square basics or any Punnett square problems, always find the genotypes of the parents, put them in the Punnett square, draw out the Punnett square, and then from there you can figure out the ratios and answer probability questions. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good one.